Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'll be taking a look at the 2024 Senate elections, and I'll be giving you all an update on these races. Today is October the 15th, so this is going to be the second to last ever 2024 Senate prediction I'll be releasing. Of course, the last one will be likely the night before the election, so we'll be doing all of that, in November, but this is the final October Senate prediction. I'll be giving you all an update on these races. So with that being said, let's get into it. We're going to begin by filling out, as we always do, our safe Democratic states. These are going to be the states that we normally would expect to be in the safe column. For the most part, again, what you're going to see is that these states shouldn't be a big surprise. Minnesota and Virginia are here just because of strong Democratic incumbents. Maine is there. Technically, it should be safe for the independent, but the independent Angus King is a longtime senator who's been caucusing with the Democratic Party. So Democrats are going to be at 42 safe seats here. Republicans, we're going to give them their safe seats now. They're going to win a couple of these. And it's going to be interesting because, as you can see here, Republicans are going to be very, in a very good position to flip back this chamber, because when you add in their safe states, they're only 4 seats away from getting to 50 and only 5 seats away from an outright majority. Remember, you need 50 seats if you win the presidency, 51 seats if you do not, because the vice president breaks the tie, and the vice president obviously is the same party as the president. So let's talk about some likely Democratic states here. This map is getting very interesting. We're getting close to really knowing, having a very good feel for these races. And, what's interesting is that I think some races have the chance to be underratedly close. And one of those states, or, one of those races, I should say, is New Mexico, where if we take a look at the polling average in New Mexico, we can see that Martin Heinrich, the Democrat who is the incumbent senator here, hasn't opened too big of a polling lead. Normally incumbent senators who run in safe states tend to open pretty big polling leads because their opponents have so little name recognition. But Heinrich hasn't really been polling all that great. I think this is kind of underratedly bad for him, to be honest. And while I don't think he's at any real risk of losing, I do think this race is going to be closer than a lot of people think. So this is one, it's a sleeper. I think it could be a lot closer than a lot of people are anticipating. Now, on the other side, I think Nevada is going to stay in the likely Democratic column. This is certainly on the lower end of it, and obviously maybe it could shift back into lean before Election Day. But for now, I really think that Republicans have really shot themselves in the foot here. And again, what's interesting about Nevada is that there's Sam Brown, the GOP candidate here, really shouldn't be polling as poorly as he is. He's down by 9%, and Jackie Rosen's a fine incumbent, but no one could have predicted her polling lead to be this strong. I mean, again, she's only served for one term. It's not like she's an entrenched 40-year incumbent here. And yet she leads consistently. And what we've seen is that Republicans have given up here. They've pulled out of Nevada. They said, hey, look, we can win the Senate map a lot easier. We don't need to win Nevada. We can afford to lose it. We're not going to play here. And that's resulted in Rosen leading by, many points. Again, RMG Research, which is a formerly GOP-aligned poll, it's now a pretty nonpartisan one. They have Rosen up by 16. She's up by 9 in Emerson, up by 7 in Redfield, up by 8 in Inside Advantage. That's a GOP poll. Then another GOP poll, which was the Remington poll, had her up by 6. That's the best poll for Brown we've seen in months. So to me, this is all pretty good evidence that Nevada is going to stay blue. I'd be very surprised if Sam Brown actually pulled this off. Even though I think Trump could win the state, it looks like Jackie Rosen's going to win re-election by a pretty good amount. So that's going to do it for our likely Democratic states. We're now going to get into our likely Republican states. So the first here is going to be Nebraska. Now, Nebraska is usually a state that's in the safe red column. But if we look at this polling average, it is crazy. Deb Fischer leads by just 1% right now, and that is absolutely absurd for Nebraska standards. I mean, usually Republicans win here by 15, 20, 25 points, and yet we've got a close race on our hands. So the unfortunate thing for just us, I think, as analysts, is that we don't have a lot of nonpartisan polling. The Osborne campaign internals have him up. The Fischer campaign internals have her up, but not by a lot, really. And then the independent polls we've seen are kind of all over the place. So the Bullfinch group actually had Osborne up by 5, which is very interesting. But then the Survey USA split ticket poll from the end of August, they had Dan Osborne down by 1 with a lot of undecided voters. So I'm going to defer to putting this race in the likely Republican column. I know a lot of people might want me to move it down to lean because the polling is so close. But again, we have a lot of undecided voters who are going to skew Republican. Osborne's winning essentially every Democrat and most independents, but that's not enough to win Nebraska, which is a deeply red state. And we have to remember that we've seen races like this before. In Utah, Evan McMullin ran as an independent, and he still lost by 11. He ran a good campaign. He still lost by 11 points. In 2014 in Kansas, we saw an independent Greg Orman run against Pat Roberts, the incumbent GOP senator, and Orman actually led in most polling in October. Like he was polling better than Dan Osborne is right now. And what do we see? Orman lost by, I think, 8 to 10 points on election day. It wasn't even that close. So Osborne can get to 42. He can get to 43. I think he's going to outrun Harris by, double digits, really. We could certainly see that happening, I think, in a best case scenario for him. But realistically, these undecided voters, they're going to break for Fisher because she is the Republican incumbent. And as we can see, even in the more recent polling rate, the Fisher internal, Osborne can get to 42. I think he can even get to 44 or 45. But Fisher, she's only at 48, and she's going to win the vast majority of those undecided voters, and that's what matters here. It'd be a different story if Osborne was at 48 and Fisher was at 49, and that was what the lead looked like. But because there's so many undecided voters, I think they're going to come home for Deb Fisher. Now, Missouri, this one's going to also be likely Republicans. It's a bit less interesting. It's just, I think, kind of a margin state where I do expect Josh Hawley to perform pretty badly in the St. Louis suburbs, which do comprise a big share of the electorate. They're pretty Republican-leaning, but Hawley is not the most popular senator. He's kind of a controversial figure, and we've seen that a lot of the very right-wing Republican incumbents in safe states or in safe districts, they underperform even if they don't lose. And then lastly, Florida's going to stay in the likely column. I know a lot of people want me to move it to lean, but, the fact of the matter here is that Democrats still haven't led a nonpartisan poll, and for me to put it in lean, I want them to have led at least one. And what we've really seen here is that, even the best polls for Debbie Merkelsel-Powell still have her down. And some of them have been close, to be fair, right? Marist is a pretty good pollster. I like them a lot. They had it within 2, which I think is a concerning sign for Rick Scott. But again, Florida polling, Republicans have done fine relative to their polls in the past years. Florida is a state, party registration data really good for Republicans. Turnout data has been really good for Republicans. And just in general, this is a state where Democrats haven't won anything statewide since 2018. They haven't won anything federally since 2012. So I'm comfortable, betting on Rick Scott to win by a pretty good amount yet again. So with that being said, we've got 7 states left to talk about. Republicans up to 49. If Trump's going to win the presidency, they only need 1 more. If Trump doesn't win the presidency, they need 2 more. The good news for them is that there's still 3 Trump states from 2020 on this map that Republicans can win Senate seats in. But we'll start out with the lean Democratic states, and we're going to start in the West with Arizona. Arizona, like Nevada, is a state that Republicans have really, really given up on it. And I mean, they've essentially pulled out on other advertising here because we see a similar thing in Arizona as we do in Nevada. Democrats lead by 8 points. Ruben Gallego's up by 7.6%, and he's close to 50 in the polling average. He's at 50% essentially as a non-incumbent. And again, the best pollsters, right? New York Times Siena, Gallego, he's up by 7 when they push undecided voters. He's up by 7 in Emerson College. He's up by 10 in RMG. He's up by 7 in Fabrizio, which is Donald Trump's pollster. Then the GOP internal polls, right, like this one, Gallego's up by 6. And then we saw the Trafalgar poll from last month had Gallego up by 4, and that's the only poll that's really showed it close. So to me, the fact that the polls are just so bad for Republicans, they need a generational polling miss to even be at a 50% chance to win here. And Kari Lake, this is the GOP candidate. She's running, I'd say, a pretty bad campaign. And again, she ran for governor in 2022 and lost to Katie Hobbs. And since then, she's made it really a big point of her campaign that she should be the governor of Arizona right now, that she lost that she legitimately won that election. And she's made, claims of voter fraud that were not true. And she's, I think, kind of gone down the path that a lot of Republicans are concerned about, where they become unelectable because of their stances on election denialism. So I think that Republicans really should have been competitive in this race, and because of Kari Lake's candidacy, they're not. And that, to me, is going to put it in the lean Democratic column. Now, joining Arizona in lean Democratic column, I'm going to put Michigan. Now, Michigan is, I think, of these 3 Rust Belt states, the one where Republicans have competed the least in the past few weeks. And I don't say it's necessarily, I wouldn't say it's a bad take for Republicans, because I do think that they have a good chance in Wisconsin, at least a solid chance in Pennsylvania. But for now, I'm going to say Michigan is probably still, I'll agree with them. I think it's the best for Democrats. Alyssa Slotkin's up by 4, and she's obviously the former congresswoman from the 7th district in the center of the state. Competitive district. She knows how to win tough races. Mike Rogers is a fine candidate for Republicans, but he hasn't raised nearly as much money as Slotkin has throughout the course of the campaign, and the polls have been really good for Slotkin. Again, what's interesting to me is that all but one poll, one really big outlier from Atlas Intel, as you can see here. Like, this is a huge outlier right here. All but one poll from Atlas Intel, they show Slotkin ahead, right? Emerson, she's up by 5. Quinnipiac had her tied, which is a concern for her, but she's up by 4 in the Glenn Griff poll, which is a local Michigan poll that's been pretty good. Again, RMG, she's up by 6. She's tied in Trafalgar, which had Trump winning the state in 2020. And the consistent thing about this is that she's outrunning Kamala Harris by 3 to 4 points in every poll. And obviously, Kamala Harris, I think, could lose Michigan. If you watch that video from yesterday, you'll know that I think she's a slight favorite to win it, probably by about 2% maybe. But let's say she loses it by a point, right? Which would be more than Hillary Clinton lost it by in 2016. Hillary Clinton in 2016 lost it by like 0.3%. But let's say Harris loses it by a full point. Slotkin, if you believe the polls, would still win by 2 because she's outrunning Harris by around 3%, if not more in some polls. So I think for Rogers to win, Trump's going to have to win Michigan by 3 points, and that's going to be difficult for him because Michigan, like, that would be the best result for Republicans in Michigan in, I think, like 30 or no, more than 30 years, like since, I think, 1980s. So obviously, I think Rogers has a path here, but just given the fact that he is underperforming Trump by a good amount in the polls, even if Trump wins the state, I don't see him winning, and that's, I think, why I'm fairly confident Slotkin will be the next senator from Michigan. Now, Pennsylvania, I think, is a bit closer, but I do believe Democrats are still favored here. Now, the Republicans have been getting really excited about Pennsylvania because they see some momentum for David McCormick, who, to be fair, was down by 8 points, right? Like, at a certain point in August, he was down by 8, and then he was down by 7, and it's down to a 5-point race, right? So the gap is closing. McCormick has gained steam. He's gained a couple points in the past few weeks, really. And so I definitely think he has a chance here. The advantage for him is that Donald Trump is going to likely do pretty poorly in the Philadelphia suburbs, even if he does win the state. McCormick is running a much more moderate campaign, and he's likely to outperform Trump by a good amount in those counties outside of Philadelphia. Now, the bad news for McCormick is that Casey and the rest of the state has an advantage because Casey will likely outrun Harris by even more in, say, Scranton, in the areas outside of Pittsburgh, in Erie, and especially with working class voters who didn't vote for Joe Biden in 2020, who likely won't vote for Kamala Harris in 2024. Bob Casey, they voted for him in 2018. They voted for Democrats in 2022. So I could see a lot of working class voters vote for Trump, but also vote for Bob Casey in the Senate just because he's been around in Pennsylvania for so many cycles and because he knows how to win these races. And that's why I think you have to give him the benefit of the doubt here. He also just has a 5-point polling lead, which I think is fine, right? Right now, Harris is up by about a point in Pennsylvania, so Casey's outrunning him by 4, which is good for him because I don't think Harris will lose Pennsylvania by anywhere near 4. And then obviously the better polls, like New York Times has Casey up by 4. Emerson has Casey up by 2. Quinnipiac has him up by 8, but they are kind of all over the place. Even Trafalgar, which again, I believe has Trump ahead here, they have Casey up by 2. And then another poll that I like in Pennsylvania, we have the Cook poll, they have Casey up by 7, and then Fox had him up by 8 and 9. So overall, he's polling fine. McCormick has a bit of momentum. I think he'll lose by a couple points less than I would have said a few months ago. But for now, I do feel comfortable putting the state in the lean Democratic column as of right now. So with that being said, we're going to get into our Republican states here. The first is going to be Montana. Now, Montana, I think, is a borderline likely Republican state. And I'm putting it in lean just because I think some of the recent polling has been okay for Jon Tester. There was one poll that we saw that I actually heard about that I think had Tester up by 5 recently, but I don't think it was actually an official poll. I don't think it got released. But just talk about the things that we know publicly for sure, right? He's ahead in most of the polls. He's going to win, I think. I'm pretty confident he's going to win. And that's because even though he's not the incumbent, even though polling in Montana has, in recent Senate races, actually underestimated Republicans, he's still up, right, by 7 in New York Times Siena. He's still up by 6 in this POS poll. He's up by 8 in this Remington poll. And then again, right, like if we take a look at just the average here, a 5.5-point lead is pretty good. Again, for someone who's not the incumbent, it's pretty good. And what we've seen is that over time, Tester had a lead early in the summer, right? But over time, what we have seen is that as the ads have come in, as the Republicans have really begun to attack Tester, voters are coming home. This is a state that's very conservative. Donald Trump's going to win it by 15, 16 points next month. And the question is, is 15 to 16% of Montana going to split their ticket for Trump and Tester? Certainly some people are going to vote for Trump and Tester. I think Tester will do better than Harris by a good amount. But will it be by enough? Unlikely, especially because we've seen a decrease in ticket splitting over the course, of every election ticket splitting, or every general election ticket splitting has gotten smaller, right? And we've also noticed that in red states like Montana, Democrats haven't been able to hold on. In 2018, Democratic senators who were not that unpopular, right, like Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, these were Democratic senators who were up for re-election in pretty Republican-leaning states who weren't unpopular, but just didn't win because voters saw no reason to vote for them. Again, if you're a Republican in a red state and you want to help Donald Trump and to get your legislation passed, it doesn't do you any good to vote for Jon Tester. It doesn't do you any good to vote for Claire McCaskill or Heidi Heitkamp. So they're going to come home for Tim Sheehy, and Tester's going to outrun Harris. I think the exit polls on election day are going to show that voters don't necessarily dislike him, but that they want a Republican more. And by the way, that's the consequence of, right, like these GOP ads where they just hammer Tester for the votes he's taken in the Senate, because they are, as a senator, Tester has been more Democratic leaning than I think you'd expect from a Democrat from Montana. So for all those reasons, I do believe Tester is on track to lose here. Now, Texas, this is, I think, a bit better for Democrats in Montana just because presidential partisanship is so much closer there. Harris, I think, will lose Texas by like a third of the amount she'll lose Montana by. But let's talk about Texas. Texas, to me, right now is interesting just because we have seen some movement towards Colin Allred in the polls. Cruz has led by, as much as 5-6 points, and he's now down to below 4%, which is a bit of a concern for him. Then notably, as an incumbent, he's at less than 50%, right? He's at 48% of the vote in the polling right now, and that's actually, up a little bit from where he's been. Although, obviously, Colin Allred was in the 30s, and he's now up to the mid-40s, so, not all bad. And the interesting thing was that we actually got an Allred lead in a morning consult poll. So Democrats have led a poll here, unlike in Florida. And notably, the better pollsters have kind of showed a mix. Some pollsters like Marist have Democrats doing better in Florida than they do in Texas, whereas other pollsters, I think like New York Times, have Democrats doing a lot better in Texas. And the final NYT Siena poll that pushed undecided, they had Cruz up by 4. So right now, I think that's the margin I'll go with. I do think Ted Cruz is going to underperform what a lot of people think he's going to do, right? Like he's an incumbent senator who's not very popular in the suburbs. You have a lot of moderate voters maybe voted for Greg Abbott in 2022, or maybe even voted for Trump in 2020, who now post Dobbs, right? Especially when I think the Kamala Harris campaign has done a decent job at targeting that group, like really honing in on them, are going to come home not only for Kamala Harris, potentially for Democrats down the ballot, especially against a Republican incumbent like Ted Cruz is not particularly popular, or is at least, I'd say, at least controversial. So Republicans would win the majority, but the question is how big of a majority is it going to be? Now, Wisconsin and Ohio, I think you could make the case for being toss-ups. I'm going to keep Wisconsin in the Till Democratic column, and I know a lot of people are not going to like that take because I think a lot of people still believe Tammy Baldwin's on track to win by 5-6 points. But what we've seen is that Baldwin, her lead has narrowed up a decent amount, right? A couple of points. And we've actually gotten some polls I think are a bit concerning for her. So Quinnipiac had her outrunning Harris by 6, which is a good sign for her because obviously Harris will not lose Wisconsin by 6. But on the other hand, right, like Quinnipiac in the Midwest has been very, very bearish on Republicans in the past, and they're now showing Republicans winning or Trump winning these 3 states presidentially. And in Wisconsin, this is, I think, a pretty bad result for Baldwin, for her to only be up by 6. And you consider, their past Senate polls in the region. Furthermore, you look at the polls like Emerson. I've already talked about Quinnipiac, Emerson, and I think NYT Siena is a decent pollster, right? But I think Emerson's just the best example of this, right? Where you have the Republicans closing the gap. Eric Hovde at 46% of the vote, Tammy Baldwin at 50%. That's a margin that I think with a normal Wisconsin polling miss, you could see Republicans winning. Now, again, I'm not a huge fan of using past polling miss to predict future error, but what we do know is that Wisconsin, really 2 presidential elections in a row, we've seen the same exact polling miss. It's a 7-point miss in the favor of Republicans, and if you apply that here, Hovde would win. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'd still rather be Tammy Baldwin at this point, but what we do know is that you can't count it out, and that's why I think this race is a bit closer than a lot of people are giving it credit for being at the moment. I'm open to moving this back to the lean column before Election Day. I want to get more early voting data. I want to get an estimate for what the turnout is going to be, especially in Dane County and in Milwaukee. But I do believe that the level of ticket splitting between Harris and Baldwin is going to be smaller than people think. And I do believe Eric Hovde has actually ran a decent campaign in the past few months. And for that reason, I want to recognize that and put Wisconsin, as a close race than I've had it in the past. So now Ohio's the last state, and I think Ohio's the only state that is genuinely like a pure toss-up here. The good news for Democrats is that Sherrod Brown has been polling like okay. Um, the New York Times Siena poll had him up by 4, which is pretty good for him, especially because they had Harris losing Ohio by 6, so that's a 10-point ticket split. And I think that's a 10-point ticket split would make Brown a very narrow favorite, right? I think Harris loses Ohio because Biden lost Ohio by 8 points in 2020. I think Harris loses it by maybe 9. So if you apply 10-point ticket split, I think Brown would have like a 60% chance of winning. And by the way, 60% is not a big, is the 60 to 40 advantage is essentially flipping a coin. It's like, obviously a coin's 50-50 or it should be 50-50, but like a 60-40 is still a toss-up race. It's still at the higher end of toss-up. But then, some of the other polls like WAPO only had Brown up by 1, Marist only had him up by 2, and I think this is really a big concern for him. I would like him to be up by more in Marist because they usually are pretty bullish on Democrats in these Senate races across the country. They're a good pollster, but I think you have to take that into account. And then RMG actually had Moreno up by 2, and this is I think a high quality nonpartisan poll that are showing Moreno winning. So it's very close right now. I'm gonna give it to the GOP just purely out of the fact that I think that Brown isn't up by enough to make me comfortable. He's also not at 50%. And what we've seen in Ohio is that the polling data in this state tends to be wrong, but not in the normal sense. Democrats, the number they're at on election day in the polls is usually what they get. I wonder if it won't show me 2022, of course, but Tim Ryan ended up getting 47% of the vote, and I think he was at 46% on election day in the polls. Joe Biden was, I think, essentially in a dead heat in Ohio on election day 2020, and he was at 46 or 47. He ended up getting a little over 45. So the polls usually get the Democratic vote share right, or maybe overestimate it by a little under a point. But the Republicans tend to win over undecided voters at pretty high rates just because Ohio is a red-leaning state nowadays and because the polls do kind of miss that working-class Republican-leaning voter. And so Bernie Moreno is not in a bad position right now. He's had a bit of a blitz over the course of the past few months, and he's really cut the spending advantage that Brown had from the summer. So I think Republicans are in a decent position here. They've really invested in it. They really want to knock off Sherrod Brown, and that's kind of the result of them giving up in, say, Nevada and Arizona, where, I think they could have been playing a bit harder here, but at the expense of Ohio. And Mitch McConnell has realized, look, we don't need to win all these states. We don't need to sweep all these battleground states to win the Senate. We just need to get a couple and lock down the Trump states. And in Ohio, I think that's what they're doing, and I believe it'll pay off for them on Election Day. This is the state where I think I could really see myself moving it back to the Democrats on Election Day, just because if we get some good early vote data or if we get some good polling for Sherrod Brown, if it goes up to a 3-point lead, I can move it back to Brown. But for now, the fact that he's not at 50%, the fact that his lead is within the margin of error is too much for me to ignore, and I'm going to call him the narrow underdog as of right now, but I think this is about as close as it gets for a Senate race. So let me know what you all think. Let me know what you're expecting, and I'll see you all in the next video.